Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled Farm to Summer, Incorporating Local Foods and Providing Garden Experiences in Summer Food Service Programs. This webinar is being presented by the Pennsylvania Department of Education, Division of Food and Nutrition, in collaboration with Project PA. I'm Director of Project PA, Elaine McDonnell, and I will moderate the webinar and co-conduct one of the presentations. We have a series of presentations planned for today. There will be an intro presentation that I will co-present with Audrey Hess, Public Health Nutrition Consultant from the Pennsylvania Department of Education. And then we'll follow that with two best practices presentations. First, we'll hear from Weston Petrosky, Nutrition Coordinator at Project Share of Carlisle. Weston's presentation will be followed by Giselle Cosentino, Director of Camp Garrett in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. Okay, we have several things to talk about today. First, we'll be doing an overview of Farm to Summer. And then because one of the components of Farm to Summer is local procurement, we first need to make sure we're all on the same page in terms of general procurement principles. So we'll talk about procurement principles, regulations, and procurement methods. And then we'll get into defining local. Who defines local? How can you define local? And where can you find local products? Then we'll discuss local procurement, as well as a tool that can be used within local procurement called geographic preference. We'll also discuss some other ways to bring local into summer food service programs. We'll talk about summer food program gardens, and finally end with some resources for additional information. So Farm to Summer is the combination of procuring local foods, and that could be local food served in meals as part of taste tests, celebrating local foods in special events, cooking demonstrations with local foods, combined with food education, which generally works well as experiential education on a farm or in a classroom. So it could mean taking field trips to farms or farmers markets or hosting farmer visits to your program. It's common to find that gardens are the heart of a Farm to Summer program, and that's because gardens have the ability to provide all of the pieces of a Farm to Summer program. Produce from the school gardens can be used in the meals programs, and school gardens are also providing natural hands-on environments for experiential learning. Some of the benefits of Farm to Summer: serving local foods can add variety and appeal to your meals. It can also serve as an opportunity to introduce children to new products or familiar items in their freshest state. Summer is often a time of agricultural abundance, so because those fresh fruit and vegetables are so widely available, that may reduce your purchasing costs for those items. Purchasing local foods can support regional and local economic development, and summer is a great time to involve children in gardening and other hands-on learning activities that reinforce healthy habits and keep them interested and engaged in summer programming. Okay, I mentioned that one of the components of Farm to Summer is local foods, but before we get into how to procure local foods, we're going to just briefly review some procurement principles and regulations. First, what is procurement? Procurement is the purchasing of goods and services. And why are procurement rules important? Procurement rules ensure that taxpayer dollars are used effectively and efficiently without waste or abuse. Procurement regulations also ensure that program benefits are received by eligible programs and children. There are some key concepts within procurement: American grown, knowledge of state and local regulations, competition, and responsive and responsible. So the first of these, American grown, there is a Buy American provision that's a requirement for some school food service programs and a recommendation for others. And to explain that, the National School Lunch Act requires school food authorities to purchase domestically grown and processed foods to the maximum extent practicable. And there are two exceptions to that. One is if the product is not produced in the United States in sufficient quantities of a satisfactory quality, or two, if the price of a domestic product is significantly higher than that of a foreign-grown product. This Buy American provision is not found in the regulations for the Summer Food Service Program or the Child and Adult Care Food Program. However, it does apply for National School Lunch Program sponsors that also sponsor the School Food Service Program. So it is a requirement for NSLP sponsors that sponsor the Summer Food Service Program, and for others, it's a recommendation. There can be procurement requirements at the federal, state, and local levels, and you need to be aware of all of those regulations. Competition is probably the most important principle of a sound procurement. The regulations use the term full and open competition, which means that all potential suppliers are on a level playing field. Competition helps ensure that taxpayer dollars are used efficiently and effective. A competitive procurement environment ensures that schools will receive the best price and the highest quality product. So there are some things that can be done that are not allowable because they are considered competition killers. So for example, you cannot place unreasonable requirements on firms. An example of this would be requiring potential suppliers to employ at least 100 employees. You don't want to have organizational conflicts of interest. For example, awarding a contract to a relative. You can't specify that you'll only accept a brand name product without allowing an equal product to be offered. You can't write specifications that are too narrow and limit competition. So, for example, written such that only one potential supplier could respond. You can't allow potential contractors or suppliers to write or otherwise influence your specifications, and you can't use local as a product specification. And this might be a little confusing considering we'll be talking about local procurement. Hopefully this will become clearer throughout the presentation, but essentially a specification is a requirement, and you cannot make local a requirement. You can use local as a preference, and you can institute some other strategies to increase the likelihood that you will receive a local product. So some of the language that you couldn't use is that the solicitation is restricted to producers within the state, that you're only looking for producers within a 150-mile radius, that you're soliciting quotes or bids for Pennsylvania-grown products, or that you will only accept products grown within a 300-mile radius. Responsive and responsible is the last concept. This becomes particularly important when we get into talking about local procurement. Awards must be made to vendors that are both responsive and responsible. So responsive means that the vendor submits a bid or a quote that conforms to all terms of the solicitation. So for example, if you are putting out a solicitation for apples and a vendor replies with a quote for peaches, that's considered not responsive. Or if you require delivery and the supplier tells you that you must pick up the product, that's considered not responsive. The vendor must also be responsible, which means that they are capable of performing successfully under the terms of the contract or the agreement. So, for example, if you receive references and you check those references and you find that a particular vendor did not meet the terms of a previous agreement. Maybe they didn't provide the quality of product that they had promised or didn't meet the delivery schedule. Then that supplier would be considered not responsible. Okay, let's get into looking at some procurement methods. First of all, within the Summer Food Service Program, you have three options for procuring meals. First is self-preparation, where you purchase the food and prepare the meals yourself. You could also opt for sponsor to sponsor, which is when you purchase meals from another sponsor of a child nutrition program, and the meals are either dropped off or picked up. And vended service is where you purchase meals from a food service management company, and the management company prepares the food at their location and meals are dropped off at your site. When you are procuring meals for self-preparation, when you're purchasing your own food, there is a distinction made between formal and informal purchasing, and this distinction is made based on a small purchase threshold. The current federal small purchase threshold is $150,000. States or localities can institute smaller small purchase thresholds. In Pennsylvania, we're fortunate that the Pennsylvania threshold for perishable items matches the federal threshold, which is $150,000. So above that amount, you would, above that amount, you would use a formal method for purchases, which we're not going to get into in much detail because we don't think that the majority of you are using this method. Below $150,000, you can use an informal purchasing method, which involves getting price quotes, or if it's up to equal to $3,500, you can use a micro purchase. This slide is showing procurement for self-preparation, similar to the previous slide. It just outlines the 3 procurement methods. So the steps of a micro purchase, again, $3,500 or less, you develop specifications, you contact a vendor and make the purchase, you distribute the micro purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. So this means that if you are making multiple micro purchases, you have several qualifying suppliers who could provide that product, you need to distribute them equitably among those suppliers and not go repeatedly to the same supplier. You must retain documentation for 3 years plus the current year. Steps of informal procurement, this is above $3,500 and up to $150,000. You develop the specifications, identify and gather at least 3 quotes from suppliers that are eligible, able, and willing to provide products. And this is where it differs from the micro purchase method. Evaluate vendors' responses to the specifications, determine the most responsive and responsible vendor at the lowest price and award the contract, manage the purchase, and retain documentation for 3 years plus the current year. Formal procurement, again, we are assuming that most of you are not using this method, so just very briefly, you develop the solicitation, you publicly announce the invitation for bid or the request for proposal, and this public announcement or advertising makes it different than the previous methods that we discussed. You evaluate the vendor's responses to the specifications. You award the contract to the most responsive and responsible vendor at the lowest price, manage the contract, and retain documentation for 3 years plus the current year. If you are procuring meals from a sponsor, once you've prepared your specifications, you can contact one or more sponsors to get a price quote. The other sponsors, such as a school, church, or daycare, must participate in at least one of the child nutrition programs, like the Summer Food Service Program, National School Lunch Program, Child and Adult Care Food Program. The price quote in this case will be a price per meal. One thing to keep in mind is that the competitive procurement methods do not apply to sponsor arrangements. So regardless of the dollar amount, you don't need to obtain a certain number of quotes or advertise. If you choose to purchase meals from another sponsor, you will need to have a signed agreement in place, and that agreement should be submitted to PDE to keep on file. Your third option for procuring meals in the Summer Food Service Program is from a food service management company that is registered with PDE. And in this case, the micro purchase method is not applicable. The formal threshold for vended meals starts at just over $10,000 as opposed to $150,000. A contract is required regardless of the dollar amount. So for informal procurement, you'll obtain at least 3 price quotes by entering your specifications into PDE's standard contract document and providing the document to potential food service management companies on PDE's list of registered food service management companies. The contract is awarded to the management company with the lowest price. For vended meals, formal procurement starts at just over $10,000. So using formal procurement, you'll enter your specifications into PDE's contract document. The contract document also serves as the invitation for bid. Then you would advertise and solicit food service management companies and award the contract to the lowest price, responsive, and responsible food service management company. Now I'm going to turn it over to Audrey, who will talk about defining local and where to find local foods.
Thank you, Elaine. I don't seem to be able to advance slides, so if you don't mind advancing through my section, that would be great. A common question coming into a local procurement conversation is, what is local? We'll talk about defining local, as well as ideas for where to find foods grown locally to your summer meals program. Any component of a meal may be able to be sourced locally. While vegetables and fruits may come to mind first, local meat and meat alternates, milk, and grains also may be available. Some summer sponsors develop entirely new recipes or even menus based on what is produced in their area. Local foods can be a part of breakfast, lunch, dinner, or snack menus, or used for taste tests as part of an educational program. It's up to each summer meals sponsor to set a definition for local that works for their particular needs and goals. Having specific goals for your purchasing efforts will help you to craft a definition for local that works in service to your goals. For example, if you're trying to get as much local product into the meal program as possible, you might consider a fairly broad definition of local that includes surrounding states in the region as well as Pennsylvania. If local livestock products are abundant in your region, but local fruits and vegetables are scarce, you might consider different definitions for local for different types of products. Remember that what you define as local can frame who you purchase products from, how these products are grown, and where your funds are going. It's essential to have a definition of local, but remember that your definition can change as your program does. The maps on this slide provide examples from Pierre, South Dakota. The image on the left shows that the sponsor is taking a regional approach to the definition of local, including parts of states surrounding South Dakota. The center picture shows that the sponsor is defining local as within the state, and the final image shows that the sponsor is using a smaller mile radius as its definition of local. Local applies to the product, the food, and not the address of the vendor. On this slide, you see examples of how child nutrition program sponsors have chosen to define local. Page County Public Schools in Virginia uses a tiered definition. Their first priority is to source products from within their county, then from within 90 miles of Luray, and thirdly, products from within the state. Upper Moreland School District in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, defines local as within the state of Pennsylvania or within 100 miles of the school district, if not from within the state. What is in season in your area? A good way to pick up on that is to take a look at the farmers market at different times of the year to know when different products are harvested. Penn State Extension can provide examples and information about local seasonal products. The USDA Census of Agriculture reports quantities of many agricultural products by state or even broken down further by county. Seasonality charts made for a specific region show what is in season during what months of the year. The Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture's PA Preferred program has designed this seasonality chart specific to Pennsylvania climate and harvests. PA Preferred's website also hosts an interactive map to help you to locate producers for a specific agricultural product. You can select by the category of foods or a specific food and can specify a part of the state where you would like to search. There are many routes through which you might purchase local foods. Distributors may carry local products. Finding out what a distributor sells that is local is a relatively easy way to bring local products into summer meals without creating separate distribution channels. If you are a summer sponsor that contracts with a vendor to purchase meals, you can express in your solicitation the desire that the vendor procure local foods. Sponsors may opt to buy local ingredients and procure services of a processor to convert the locally grown product to a finished product such as salsa, apple chips, ready-to-serve chicken legs, or hamburger patties. Some sponsors purchase foods directly from local farmers, ranchers, and fishers. Even when you are getting food straight from the source, however, there are many ways to go about it. Sometimes the solicitation requests farmers to deliver products straight to the sponsor or a central warehouse, and other times sponsors pick up produce at the farm or a farmer's market. The delivery method must be specified at the time of solicitation. In some areas, producers have organized into co-ops, aggregating their products and combining their marketing efforts. Food hubs serve a similar function. These groups are more likely than a single small-scale producer to be able to fulfill large orders, deliver directly, and to provide some minimal processing. School or summer food program gardens may also be a good source for very local products. We'll talk about this further later in the webinar. Summer meal sponsors often are buying at least some local items, perhaps without realizing it. Fluid milk, for example, is expensive to transport, so milk from the local area would often be less expensive than milk transported farther. Some distributors look to source products locally and may or may not advertise that in their ordering systems, so ask them. Once you know what products on your menu are already local, it's time to start thinking about what additional products could be local. Consider items on your menu that you could easily replace with local products. For example, in recipes, look at vegetables that are used and consider where you might substitute a seasonal local vegetable. And with this, I'll turn it back to Elaine to talk about how to target local in procurement.
Thanks, Audrey. We've seen this diagram earlier. Now we're going to go and look at each procurement method and discuss how to procure locally within each method. So we'll begin with micro purchase, and again, this is purchases up to the value of $3,500, or that do not, I should say, that do not exceed $3,500. With micro purchases, sponsors purchase the product from a vendor that they have found that is offering an acceptable price, document the transaction, and distribute micro purchases equitably among qualified suppliers. So in this case, you're not required to get multiple quotes or advertise, so you can contact and work with any vendor that you feel is offering a fair price. A couple of things to note about micro purchases. First, that while micro purchases are allowable, they are not required. So for example, you may be making a purchase that is less than $3,500, but you could use an informal procurement method, or for that matter, even a formal procurement method, and get multiple quotes if you feel that that would be most economically advantageous to your program. Regarding the step that states document the transaction, sometimes a question arises about the acceptability of handwritten receipts when a sponsor is purchasing from a farm stand, farmer's market, CSA, or directly from a farm. Handwritten receipts are acceptable as long as the receipt includes the date of the purchase, the name of the vendor or farm, the item cost, the amount purchased, and the total cost. So let's take a look at some examples and see whether or not a micro purchase is an acceptable method. Active Kids Summer Program wants to celebrate Farm to Summer by serving local produce as part of their meal program. The program operator purchases fresh strawberries and spinach from Fresh Foods Farm on June 1st. The total cost of the purchase is $1,800. Is this an acceptable micro purchase? The answer is yes. As long as the program operator has equitably distributed all previous micro purchases and determines the price is reasonable, this is allowable. Another example, Summer Fun Meals Program serves lunch at eligible community gardens where they often have guest speakers from the 5 nearby farms teach students about the various fruits and vegetables they grow. This year they've decided to purchase local food from one of those farms, Hometown Produce. They bought $1,000 worth of greens in June, $1,400 worth of berries in July, and $1,000 worth of stone fruit in August. Is this an allowable micro purchase? This one gets a little tricky. In this example, if we assume that the other 4 nearby farms are also able to meet Summer Fun Meal Program's needs, then this would not be allowable since Summer Fun did not equitably distribute the purchases. If Hometown Produce is the only vendor able to provide the requested items, then this may be allowable, assuming the price is reasonable, the transaction is below $3,500, and previous micro purchases were equitably distributed. Now let's move to local procurement using the informal procurement method, which is less than $150,000. In order for a vendor to be considered responsive and responsible, the bidder must meet any product specification and other requirements that are outlined in your solicitation. And you can use these specifications and requirements to target local products. So for an example, you could write a specification targeting a particular variety that is unique to the region and happens to be in season. You can include some requirements around freshness, for example, requiring product delivery within 24 to 48 hours of harvest. And this accomplishes a couple of things. First, it ensures that you get a very fresh product, but it also really increases the chances that that product will be a local product. And then there are some potential specifications or requirements that might reflect some value that you place. For example, a size of a farm. Maybe you want to target farms of a certain size. You can look at farm practices such as integrated pest management procedures, harvest techniques. Maybe you want to require that the farm used harvest by hand techniques, crop diversity, farms that raise a certain number of crops or livestock. If you're working with a distributor, you can require origin labeling. So if you're developing the contract, you can require that they include farm of origin or county of origin labeling. You can look at ability to provide farm visits or class visits. So you can require some participation in the educational component of your program. Perhaps you want the farm to be able to sponsor field trips for your children, or you want them to come to your program and participate in some educational activities. Those can be included among your specifications, and those types of requirements are really going to target local vendors. Other things to consider when writing specifications, first is to be flexible. Can you accept a product that perhaps has a little cosmetic damage? Is it a product that's going to be processed further, so maybe that's not that important and would open the market more to local vendors? Don't include unnecessary requirements. Perhaps when you have produce delivery, you usually require delivery on a refrigerated truck. But if you're just doing a solicitation for apples, that might not be required, and that might target a local producer who doesn't have a refrigerated truck for delivery. But also consider what a vendor who may be new to selling to summer meals might not know. So for example, condition upon receipt of product and food safety needs. We've heard of examples of programs receiving lettuce that is unwashed because the vendor didn't realize that it was a requirement that the product be washed upon receipt. Also, size uniformity. Do you need a uniform size product? If not, you should specify. If you do, you should specify that. If not, perhaps you are buying strawberries and they're just going to be sliced and put into a fruit salad, so you might not require a uniform product in that case. So let's take an example of a product specification. Here's a general specification. It's for zucchini. The grade is US number 1, and you would like 35 pounds per week for June through August. So how could we change this to target a local vendor? Well, for one, we might say instead of zucchini, summer squash, to open it to different varieties of summer squash. And this might open it up to a vendor who does not, or a farmer who doesn't grow specifically zucchini. Maybe you're willing to accept US number 1 or number 2 grades, and you're willing to allow cosmetic imperfections. So here's how that product specification is documented. We've reached out to 3 vendors, and they're all able to meet your specifications for product quality, delivery, packaging, and labeling. You've checked their references and past history, and they all passed the test. But then you've included some requirements or specifications to target local products. So you want the supplier to be able to provide educational cafeteria or classroom visits and to provide state of origin on all products. And only Great Gourds and Sammy's, Great Gourds is able to meet all of these specifications. Sammy's Squash is only able to provide state of origin. So Great Gourds in this case is the only responsive and responsible vendor. Again, informal procurement requires 3 quotes and a purchase. So here's the specification that we've developed. You're contacting vendors and you're documenting each vendor's quotes. In this case, Fairy Veggies is $40, Great Gourds is $47, Sammy Squash is $37. So if they're all responsive and responsible, Sammy Squash would receive this quote or this bid. Another method that you can use, again with informal procurement, you're not advertising the solicitation, you're contacting vendors that you choose. So you can choose to contact only local vendors, assuming that you have at least 3 local vendors who could provide the product. Sponsors can arbitrarily divide purchases to fall below the small purchase or the micro purchase threshold. However, in some instances, characteristics of a product or market might justify the need to separate it from the overall food procurement. And examples would be a Harvest of the Month program, taste tests, products for a local meal celebration. But remember that you still can't use local as a specification. The final procurement method is formal, and again, we're not going to discuss this method in great detail since we believe this isn't a method that a large majority of you need to use. If you have a question about this method, at the end, Audrey is going to be talking about some local procurement resources, and those resources may help answer your questions about formal procurement. But formal procurement is done when the purchase is above $150,000 and an invitation for bid or a request for proposal is used. So what about local procurement when you're not doing self-prep, but instead are procuring services from a sponsor or a food service management company? You can still target local by integrating a preference for local through your solicitation, and there are various areas that you can integrate this preference: the background, the objectives, the responsibilities and expectations, nutrition and menu requirements, evaluation criteria, and supporting documents. But again, remember, you're indicating a preference, not a requirement for local. And I will now turn it back over to Audrey to talk about the geographic preference option.
Thanks, Elaine. So now we've got a background on the basic procurement methods and how to target local through those methods. Now we're going to look at an additional tool that can be applied to either informal or formal procurement for certain foods. The Code of Federal Regulations makes it clear that unless there's a specific exemption, a geographic preference would not be able to be used. However, the 2008 Food Conservation and Energy Act, also known as the Farm Bill, created the needed exemption. The Federal Register published the final rule for the geographic preference option for the procurement of unprocessed agricultural products in child nutrition programs. And this final rule, first of all, clarified who can define local, which, as we already discussed, is the summer food program sponsor. It defined the term unprocessed, and it also made clear that a preference is not the same as a specification. The regulations clearly define what qualifies as an unprocessed agricultural product. Specifically, the regulations say an unprocessed, locally grown, or locally raised agricultural product. This means that only agricultural products that retain their inherent character qualify to be used for geographic preference. The effects of the food handling and preservation techniques that you see on this slide are not considered to have changed the character of the product and are therefore allowable. Food handling and preservation techniques that are not allowable are heating and canning because the inherent character of the product is not retained through the heating process. Now we'll look at an example of how to incorporate geographic preference through preference points. So in this example, a summer meal sponsor contacts multiple vendors in an informal procurement process. The solicitation information shared with each vendor states a preference for apples grown within 100 miles of the sponsor's address. The solicitation makes it clear that any respondent able to provide local apples will be awarded 10 additional points. In this example, the 10 preference points are equivalent to a 10-cent reduction in the price for the purposes of evaluating the lowest bidder, or quote. Apple Lane Farms meets the stated preference for local products and receives the 10 additional points, making it equivalent to if the farm had offered a price 10 cents less. So on the table, you'll see that Apple Lane Farms quoted a price of $2.05, but the price with preference points was reduced to $1.95. And those extra points make Apple Lane Farms the lowest quote, even though the sponsor still would pay Apple Lane Farms $2.05 for its product. The equivalent price deduction for geographic preference only applies to that evaluation step and does not affect the actual price paid. This technique can be applied in both informal and formal procurement. Now we'll talk about a few additional topics related to bringing local foods into summer meal programs. Summer Meals program sponsors are eligible to use USDA foods. Every dollar's worth of donated USDA foods used in a Summer Meals menu frees up money that a sponsor would otherwise have to spend on commercial food purchases. The federal government's large volume purchasing power often allows for the procurement of food at a lower unit cost than if a sponsor were purchasing it on its own. Many child nutrition directors have begun combining USDA Foods products with local products to make a cost-effective menu item. For instance, consider combining local lettuce with USDA Foods smoked deli turkey and a whole wheat tortilla to make a wrap. You might not think of USDA Foods as locally grown products, but USDA Foods are 100% American grown, so every available product is local to someone across the country. Child nutrition program sponsors might receive donated foods from a variety of places. Suppliers may donate extra produce at the end of a harvest, or producers may collect leftover crops after the fields have been harvested, a process referred to as gleaning. Donated foods must conform to the same food safety standards as purchased products. It is recommended that sponsors review and document agricultural food safety practices of producers before accepting gleaned products. Inquire about the freshness, shelf life, and refrigeration before accepting the product. The sponsor should also be sure to record the amount of donated food in its accounts to ensure transparency and avoid any possible accusations of impropriety. Gardening activities as part of an educational program in conjunction with summer meals take advantage of the summer growing season in Pennsylvania. There are no federal regulations, neither procurement nor food safety ones, that prohibit sponsors from using garden produce in child meal programs. Sponsors are encouraged to connect with their local health departments to ensure the garden meets any local food safety regulations. When incorporating garden foods that the children have helped to grow, be sure to advertise to them when they are eating their harvest. The sign you see here is what Upper Moreland School District displays on their serving line when featuring a food from their school garden. Being involved in growing foods helps children to have positive attitudes about eating fruits and vegetables and has been shown to increase their consumption of fruits and vegetables. Affiliating garden activities with a summer meals program, of course, provides educational opportunities as well as a potential source of foods for the menu. Gardens are an excellent opportunity for community involvement in a summer meals program. Community members with gardening experience may be available to help children to learn gardening skills. Community members and families of participating children may be able to help maintain a garden. In terms of procuring garden produce for the meals program, the first option would be that it could be donated to the summer meals program. USDA does allow for purchase of some inputs for the garden, such as seeds and tools, with the nonprofit summer food program account, as long as appropriate procurement methods are used in purchasing those items and that the harvest is used within the summer meals program. An interdepartmental agreement would apply if the summer meals sponsor is a public entity and the garden is operated by a different public entity that wishes to sell the produce to the summer food program sponsor. Summer meals sponsors could also purchase garden produce through a micro-purchase or informal procurement, processes that Elaine described earlier in the webinar. Food safety rules apply to produce purchased for and served in summer meals programs, no matter where they were grown or handled. There is not an inherently greater risk with garden produce as compared with products from other sources. There is, in fact, opportunity for greater oversight of produce coming from a garden run by a summer meals program itself as compared with produce sourced elsewhere. Here are some basic points to consider in garden food safety. It's helpful to know what was happening on the land prior to its use as a garden. The garden location should be selected in an area that has low risk of contamination from prior use of the land. Penn State Extension offices are a good resource to consult regarding testing the soil for possible contaminants, such as heavy metals, as well as regarding appropriate use of compost. Regarding water sources, municipal water is considered the safest. If using rain barrels, follow guidance, which you can find from Penn State Extension or the Environmental Protection Agency. Be sure to use clean harvesting containers. Take produce directly to the food preparation area. Label and store it appropriately. And in the garden, use fences to keep animals from entering the garden area. As mentioned, a portion of nonprofit summer food service funds can be used for garden supplies, materials, and staffing, provided that the produce is then used within the context of the child nutrition program. The memos for school gardens referenced here expand on the local foods and related activities in summer meal programs memo. Now that we've covered many ways to bring local foods into the summer meals program, let's look at a few more places that you can go for further information. USDA's Local Foods and Related Activities in Summer Meal Programs with Questions and Answers addresses many of the topics that we've touched on today, making it a quick reference for USDA guidance on farm to summer. This and other farm to summer resources can be found in pairs, applications, download forms in the farm to summer section. This slide lists some helpful procurement and geographic preference resources. The transition to and implementation of 2 CFR Part 200 Question and Answer Memo answers questions regarding general requirements and procurement standards, while also addressing common questions related to appropriate micro-purchase procedures. The geographic preference Q&A memos are valuable in answering some specific questions that Food and Nutrition Service has received on the final rule. The federal procurement standards are the foundation of the procurement content of this training. Summer meal sponsors also should be aware of state and local procurement regulations and guidance. FNS worked with the Institute of Child Nutrition to create an online training focused on procurement. Excuse me. Sponsors of summer meal programs in Pennsylvania can access procurement information on pairs, applications, download forms. More items are being added to the procurement section in the near future. The Pennsylvania Department of Education, Division of Food and Nutrition, recently conducted a procurement webinar specifically for summer food service program sponsors. A recording of that webinar will be available on pairs download forms in the near future. The School Nutrition Toolbox website of training resources for Pennsylvania sponsors of school nutrition programs includes a procurement module, which has information also about local procurement. USDA has developed a variety of fact sheets on a host of topics. Several of the fact sheets are focused on procurement, and one specifically highlights farm to summer. The Procuring Local Foods for Child Nutrition Programs guide covers the information in this training regarding procuring local foods. It includes in-depth information on targeting local food purchases in formal procurement as well, and provided examples and excerpts from real solicitations. You can find the electronic version of this guide and a local foods webinar series at the USDA FNS Community Food Systems Procuring Local Foods webpage. You can sign up for USDA's Farm to Child Nutrition e-news for updates and best practices. The Food and Nutrition Service Office of Community Food Systems houses the USDA Farm to Child Nutrition team. Each of the 7 regional offices has one full-time staff member that acts as the farm-to-school regional lead. Regional leads are available to provide farm-to-school related policy guidance and interpretation, and to help state and local agencies in their region integrate local products into the child nutrition programs. Tegan Bernstein, whose name and email you see, is the regional lead for our Mid-Atlantic region. Danielle Gibb specifically works in the region with summer meals programs in promoting Farm to Summer. The Pennsylvania Farm to School Network recently launched a monthly e-newsletter focusing on farm to school in Pennsylvania. Many of the topics that will be part of the newsletter are relevant to summer food program sponsors as well. You can sign up to receive the newsletter through the link on this slide. Thanks for your time and interest. We're excited that summer meals sponsors in Pennsylvania are looking for more ways to incorporate farm to summer activities in their meal programs. Feel free to contact us with further questions.
Thanks, Audrey. And with that, I will turn it over to Weston Petrosky from Camp Share to tell us about his Farm to Summer experiences.